Hello, hello. Today, let's talk about an existential question. To fire or not to fire? It is actually a paraphrase from Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. And of course, according to Schrodinger's cat, the answer is both. But please don't tell this to a neuron, though. Just look at how shocked and surprised this neuron is. For a neuron, it's either to fire or not to fire. I know we've talked about action potentials and how, the neurons are communicating with firing and wiring. But today, let's dive deep into how does a neuron make such a decision. Before we start, let's have a look at two different types of potentials. Our brain has two potentials, right? One is excitatory postsynaptic potential. Just look at this parrot. Basically, it is a potential and just say like, let's go party. Oh, cool. And there is the inhibitory postsynaptic potential. It's kind of like this cartoon here, very zen, just like chilling, meditating, very calm, very peaceful. So EPSP, as the name suggests, excitatory, is kind of like green light. Let's do something. Let's go. And IPSP is kind of like the red light. Let's pause. Let's stop. And if you pay attention to the detail, the name is postsynaptic potential. So if you remember our previous video about how neurons communicate, the video titled Synaptic Transmission, you will know that the postsynaptic is the neuron receiving the neurotransmitters. Now, with that in mind, let's have a closer look. So if you remember in the last video, we have a similar image, right? The two neurons, one neuron is trying to communicate with the other. And, if you remember my reference, there's also the creation of man, the Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, yada, yada, yada. We also talked about SSRI and how that works in our system. We're going to continue with the theme. We have SSRI that, help us with our mood, with our sleep-awake cycle. And let's zoom in. We have the presynaptic neuron here, and this is the axon terminal from here, and we're going to zoom in. And this is a familiar image again. We have our action potential here, and we have our neuron transmitters, and in this sense, the neurotransmitters are serotonins packed in the vesicles. And if you remember from the last video, we have calciums binding to the vesicles and causing the vesicles to drop down and fuse with the presynaptic membrane. And then the serotonin will be released to the synaptic cleft here, and they will be floating around. With SSRI, if you remember, this protein transport SERT will be blocked, right? It will be blocked, and what will happen is it will cause more serotonin to floating around, give the serotonin more chance to be bonded or docked to the dendrites or the neuroreceptors of the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Now, let's zoom in from here on the dendrites as well. So if you remember last video, we also have something called the ligand-gated channels. And the ligand-gated channels are very selective. Only some neurons, some ions can be bonded to the gate and cause the gate to open. And now, what will be different, or what would cause the next action potential here is actually when we have this serotonin binding to the receptor, it will cause the positive sodium ions to float in. And what will happen is that it will increase the charges in the postsynaptic neurons. And when it reaches minus 55 millivolts, like here we suggested, it will fire the action potential for this neuron. And we are familiar with this concept. Now, let's have an example of the inhibitory postsynaptic potential. All right, let's have a look at an example of inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. So you may heard something called benzodiazepines. Some medication related to benzodiazepines are diazepam, lorazepam, alprazolam, and some brand names would be Valium, Ativan, and Xanax, right? And so these medications are helping people with anxiety, muscle spasms, panic attacks, acute agitation. And basically, if you're super anxious and you take benzodiazepine, it'll help you to calm down. So how does that help us calm down? And one related neurotransmitter is GABA, right? And it is just always in our system. And what will happen is the benzodiazepines will help to increase the effectiveness of GABA, not necessarily increase the amount, or as you know, SSRIs, we blocked the protein transport and we have more of the serotonin left in the cleft. And just remember, for this video, to simplify it, GABA is actually just there in our brain, floating in our system. And benzodiazepine is to increase the effectiveness of the neurotransmitter GABA. And we have a very similar image here. We still have our, axon terminal here. We're going to zoom in. And what we will see here, again, very similar. We have our neurotransmitters. And of course, in this case, this one would be GABA. And we would have the similar processes of, calcium binding to the vesicles, vesicle drops down, and then fused with the membrane of the axon terminals, release the neurotransmitter, this time is GABA, in the synaptic cleft. Okay? And then what will happen is, as we said, we have ligand-gated channels. With the ligand-gated channels are very picky, and only certain selected ions can be bonded to those gates. So in this case, we're going to have our GABA binding into a receptor here. We don't need to dive into detail at this stage about what kind of receptor, how does it work. But for the inhibitors, what will happen is they will have two ways of working. Either they increase the potassium inside the membrane to leave, or they attract, or they open the gate for the native iron chloride into the dendrites or into the postsynaptic neurons. And imagine what would happen with more negative ions inside the neuron. It is going to be increasingly negative. So do we have action potentials here? Probably not. So here is our membrane resting potential. We usually have it as minus 70 millivolts. But with GABA increasing in our system, is going to drop to even lower and maybe eventually go back to balance. So we've seen two examples, one for IPSP, one for EPSP. And what you may not know is that maybe the first fire from the presynaptic action potential here is not enough. So the action potential will be repeatedly sending the signals to the next neuron. And same for this one, for IPSP as well. And this is kind of like, I don't know, Sheldon Cooper knocking on Penny's doors until Penny eventually opens the door. So this process, we call this temporal summation. It is to refer the process where a neuron is repeatedly firing to trigger the action potential for the next neuron. Now, what if actually in reality we have many neurons in our system? What if they have different signals, right? If you look here, we have one neuron wants to be, excited. One is like, meh. One is like, no, please stop. So how does it work here, right? This, first of all, we call this a spatial summation. Just say so much space in here to fit in all of the neurons. But how does the neuron decide if there are multiple signals? How do they decide to fire or not to fire? You ready? Boom. We have democracy. So this guy is called Plythinus, the father of Athenian democracy. This is the modern art creation of his sculpture. Anyways, so a neuron does not decide based on one signal. It actually decides on thousands of signals. And every incoming neuron has a vote, right? So if we look at this simplistically and just replace maybe this one to green, and let's just assume that theoretically they have the same effects. No signal is stronger than the other. And so, let's go party has 2 votes, and let's rest at home have 1 vote. And eventually the neuron will say, okay, let's go party. And so this is, in theory, in a simplified way, how does it decide? So now you might be thinking, like, so where in the neuron has such a mechanism? The answer is bala 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 boom. The axon heel lock. The axon heel lock acts as, the ballot counter. It will tell the next component, Axon Initial Segment, AIS, which we'll address later, what is the score? Who won? So if say E vs I, right? So excitatory vs inhibitory is 4, 2, 1, right? We fire. And then the axon initial segment, that's why it is called initial segment. This is where actually the action potential starts. Will initiate action potential to, trigger the domino effects of the wave after wave after wave for the firing. And one thing that is very, very interesting about this little guy is that it is highly adaptable. And so what does it mean? Say if a neuron, here is a lot of, there are a lot of positive charges and it's very excited. One thing it will do is it will move further and further away from the soma. And just like, this is too much heat, I need to stay away. And another thing it might do is to reduce the length of themselves. And just imagine and how efficient and how clever that is. Let's say if we have a gate here, right? And we have, that's a terrible gate. Let me do it again. So if we have a gate here, right? And we have another, so there, okay. So have 1 gate, 2 gate, 3 gate, 4 gates, 6, blah, 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 blah. And so what does it mean if the axon initial segment becomes shorter? It will use less gate. Less gate means it requires less gate to open for the sodiums to travel in with the positive charges. And it is very efficient this way. And because the neuron is already very excited, it doesn't have to be too close for the signal to travel. It doesn't need to use too many gates for the positive charges to travel in. And that's one. Another thing it can do is the opposite. When the neuron is not very positive, it's actually like laying and not feeling it today. And when the neuron is not as active or excited, the AIS actually moves closer to the soma and it will extend itself to cover more gates. More gates means more chances for the positive ions to travel in once, there is positive to trigger an action potential. And this is why our body, our neural system is so amazing and so full of surprises. And when I learned about this little guy here today, Axon Initial Segment, I didn't expect our system to be so energy efficient and so clever at the same time. And it really intrigues me even more to dive into neuroscience and psychology. And I hope you feel the same. So, in summarize, today we learned about EPSP, IPSP, and how does a neuron decide to fire or not to fire, or how, some types of neural signals. We have temporal summation, we have spatial summation. We learned a little bit about democracy. We learned about axon hillock, the counting tickets or counting vote mechanism. We learned about axon initial segments here. And I know, if I look at these, all of these gates, the sodium, the potassium, the calcium, the protein, the ligand-gated gates, I would be wondering, how many gates are there? Like how many? Just tell me, give me a number. And so that will be our next episode. We're going to talk about ion-gated channels. We'll dive into all of the gates all at once and see things clearly.